Hell was never meant to know silence, but one day it did. The fire didn't roar. The screams stopped. The darkness, usually alive with torment, froze, as if remembering something older than pain. In that instant, every demon turned its gaze upward. Something was coming. Something that didn't belong there. What kind of light walks into fire and doesn't burn? What kind of authority can make hell itself remember heaven? It wasn't an army. It wasn't a war. It was one being, an angel, stepping into the kingdom of rebellion with no weapon, no sound, no threat. And yet, his presence alone made the Prince of Darkness tremble. This is not a story about punishment. It's a story about authority, the kind that doesn't scream, doesn't strike, but simply stands. And everything else bows. I spent months searching through apocryphal fragments, banned manuscripts, and medieval codices that the church never canonized. And somewhere between the Book of Enoch and the Gospel of Nicodemus, a forgotten phrase appeared, one that theologians never mention. It spoke of an angel sent into hell, not to destroy it, but to remind it. That moment was so powerful that even Lucifer himself fell silent. What if this wasn't a myth? What if this descent actually happened and left traces that still echo through time? Before we begin, remember, Myths of Faith exists to uncover what history tried to bury, the secrets of heaven, the conspiracies of the divine, and the symbols that connect them all. Subscribe, share, and stay until the end, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about light and darkness. When hell went silent, it wasn't defeat, it was recognition. And that's where our story begins. The crucifixion was not only witnessed by men. While the earth shook, the sky darkened, and the veil of the temple tore, something else was happening, something unrecorded. The Gospels describe the cross from the ground, but none of them speak of what unfolded beneath it. Because at that same hour, in a realm deeper than death, another event began, one so forbidden that it was erased from every canonical text. I found a line, hidden in the margins of a medieval manuscript of the Acts of Pilate. It read, "And light entered the shadows, not as vengeance, but as remembrance." What light? Whose presence could descend into hell without burning? The early Gnostics called it Lux Invicta, the unconquered light. The Copts of the desert believed it was Michael, heaven's warrior. Others whispered it was Uriel, the flame of God. But some ancient rabbis wrote of a nameless envoy, sent by the Father himself, to bear witness to a divine command, that even rebellion still belonged to its creator. This descent wasn't war, it was order returning to chaos. The moment when the authority of heaven re-entered the place that had sworn never to kneel. Imagine the stillness, rivers of fire dimming, legions silenced, thrones cracking under the weight of a presence that didn't even raise its voice. Why would God send one of his own into the pit? To conquer? No, to remind. To let every fallen being feel once again what truth feels like. But there's something stranger. The Book of Nicodemus, one of the earliest Christian apocrypha, mentions that when Christ descended into Hades, he was not alone. It says a herald came before him, a being whose light prepared the way for the sun, a messenger of authority, guarding what was about to be redeemed. If this is true, then hell didn't just witness judgment, it witnessed obedience. And obedience is the one thing Lucifer can neither comprehend nor imitate. But who was this herald? Was it Michael, the eternal defender of heaven? Uriel, the guardian of divine fire? Or a being erased from every name we know? There are angels we know, Michael, the general of celestial war, Gabriel, the voice of divine command, and Uriel, the flame that burns with knowledge. But there are others, figures erased from record, referenced only in the margins of forbidden texts, described as those who walk between mercy and judgment. Among them hides the mystery of the angel who entered hell. The clues don't point to one name. Michael was heaven's sword, yes, but this descent required something else. The Book of Enoch describes Michael's role as restrainer of chaos. Yet the angel who entered hell carried no weapon, no army, and no roar. His strength was silence. His power was presence. Uriel, perhaps? His name means fire of God, but the ancient Syriac hymns refer to him not as destroyer, but as illumination, the one who reveals divine order where confusion reigns. A 9th century Gnostic fragment found in Nag Hammadi calls him the witness of dissent, saying, "He who brings light not to burn, but to expose the lie within the flame." If that's true, then perhaps Uriel was chosen not for his fire, but for his clarity, the one light capable of entering hell and not being consumed by it. But there's a third possibility, one that theologians have avoided for centuries. What if this angel had no name? A nameless envoy acting as the embodiment of obedience itself. Because in heaven's order, obedience is not weakness. It's the ultimate reflection of God's will. And if Lucifer fell by rebellion, then perhaps the only force strong enough to face him was pure submission. An angelic being whose very existence mirrored the command, "Thy will be done." Imagine it, a realm built on pride, confronted by something incapable of pride. A light that carried no identity, no desire for glory, only divine authority. That's what shook hell. Not wrath, not violence, but the unbearable purity of order returning to a place that had long forgotten it. This was not a battle between equals. It was remembrance descending into rebellion. And when this being entered hell, the fire didn't burn, it remembered. But what did that memory awaken? What did Lucifer, the self-proclaimed king of darkness, see when that light appeared before his throne? Hell is often imagined as noise, a kingdom of screams, fury, and flame. But the texts I found describe the opposite. When the angel entered, there was no battle cry, no clash of wings, only a silence that swallowed eternity. The flames bent away from him, as though remembering the heat from which they were first born. The air thickened, charged with recognition. Lucifer rose from his throne. His face, once radiant with divine reflection, flickered like a dying ember. He felt it immediately, not fear of defeat, but the ancient, unbearable reminder of what he had been. The chronicles call it the moment of remembrance, because the presence that stood before him was not power, it was truth. And truth is the one thing hell cannot endure. The angel spoke no words. His authority was not carried in sound, but in being. Where he stood, the laws of heaven reasserted themselves. Pride crumbled beneath the weight of origin. Demons that had known only rebellion began to tremble, not from punishment, but from recognition, the memory of their first creation, of light, of belonging. That was the wound they could never heal. The archangel's radiance did not scorch, it revealed. The throne beneath Lucifer's feet began to crack, not by force, but by exposure. The illusion of dominion could not stand before reality. And for the first time since his fall, Lucifer realized that power means nothing without permission. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The flames that once danced in mockery began to dim, folding inward as if bowing. The same fire that symbolized rebellion now yielded, as though confessing that even it was born from divine breath. This was no conquest. It was revelation. Darkness was not destroyed, it was reminded, but revelation always comes with cost. What happens when light reveals more than it intends, when even heaven must reckon with what hell still remembers? The greatest paradox of heaven is that authority never shouts. The angel who entered hell carried no sword, no proclamation, no fire from the altar, only obedience. That obedience, pure and unbroken, was the embodiment of divine authority itself. Because real power doesn't need to prove itself, it simply exists. Ancient theologians feared this idea. They called it silent dominion, the power of presence that commands even chaos. In the suppressed homily attributed to Pseudo-Dionysius, a single line is written: "The highest form of strength is stillness before the source." That is what this angel carried into the abyss. Stillness that terrified the fallen. Stillness that dismantled pride. Stillness that turned hell's roar into memory. Lucifer had built his empire on volume, declarations of freedom, defiance, identity. But authority like this speaks through reality, not rebellion. The Hebrew mystics used to say the name of God, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I am that I am, wasn't just a statement of being, but a vibration that sustains existence. Wherever that presence moves, creation remembers who made it. So when the angel entered hell, he didn't bring war. He brought remembrance. Every stone, every flame, every lost spirit was confronted by the truth that even rebellion cannot escape origin. The church avoided this teaching for centuries, because if true authority needs no command, then every hierarchy built on fear, on control, on titles begins to tremble. That's what Lucifer faced. Order that didn't ask for obedience, but simply made obedience inevitable. Hell was not conquered by force, but by awareness. Awareness that God's presence is not confined to heaven. It extends even into the pit. And once truth enters a lie, the lie collapses. Lucifer didn't lose to violence. He lost to remembrance. And that realization broke something in him. But here's the question no theologian dares to ask. If authority like that can silence hell, what else could it awaken? Every ancient story survives because it carries a mirror. What happened in that abyss wasn't confined to myth. It was a pattern, a divine equation repeating through history. The descent of light into darkness didn't end with an angel in hell. It continues every time truth steps into corruption and refuses to retreat. The apocryphal records speak of the cycle of descent, moments when heaven sends fragments of its authority into decaying worlds. It happened when prophets stood before kings, when reformers faced the church that silenced them, when voices of conscience entered halls of deceit and forced the powerful to tremble. The angel's descent is not an isolated event. It's a symbol that repeats through human history. A reminder that obedience to truth is itself an act of rebellion against lies. In modern times, hell wears different faces. It sits in boardrooms that trade morality for influence, in governments that twist justice into convenience, in digital altars where pride and illusion reign. But just as it was written, light still walks into darkness, and every time it does, the world shakes. Authority that doesn't shout, integrity that doesn't bend, still terrifies the fallen order. It exposes what it touches. Just as the angel stood silent before Lucifer's throne, there are moments when ordinary people, carrying unseen conviction, walk into spaces ruled by corruption and make the air tremble. That's when the pattern repeats. The angel's story isn't about divine spectacle, it's about remembrance in action. It's the courage to stand where obedience seems foolish, to shine where truth feels unwanted. Heaven still sends its envoys, not as warriors, but as witnesses. Even now, the same light that entered hell still enters history. And every time it does, the walls of darkness remember they were never permanent, but the records hint at something even deeper. A fragment that claims the angel left behind a message. A mark, a trace of divine presence carved into the heart of hell itself. What was it? A warning or a promise? In a locked vault beneath the Vatican Library lies a codex catalogued under the name Liber Obscuri. Few outside the archives know it exists. In its final pages, written in fading Latin, there's a fragment scholars have long dismissed as allegory. But when I compared it to Coptic translations from Nag Hammadi, something impossible emerged. A repeated phrase that appears nowhere else in scripture or liturgy, Remancit Lux. It means the light remained. According to the text, when the angel departed, he did not take his light with him. He left it there, buried deep within the fabric of hell itself. Not as mercy, not as warning, but as proof. A signature of authority written into rebellion's own code. A reminder that darkness, no matter how absolute, still carries a trace of its creator. Think about that. Hell itself, marked by divinity. It's a concept that erases the boundaries of theology. Because if light can remain there, if even damnation carries an echo of heaven, then the separation between the sacred and the fallen isn't final. It's structural. In the fragments margins, a scribe added a single line: "To erase light, one must first forget its source." That may be the oldest description of spiritual blindness ever written, and it aligns perfectly with the psychological truth of rebellion. Once you forget where you came from, pride becomes your only reflection. The angel's descent wasn't an invasion, it was an imprint. Light embedded in the deepest shadow to ensure that even rebellion could never be pure. Lucifer's kingdom, built on opposition, was unknowingly branded with memory. Every spark that burns there carries that paradox, that it exists only because something holy once entered. If this is true, it changes everything. It means hell doesn't belong to Satan. It's still under the same authority it once defied. But if a fragment of light remained, could it ever awaken again? In every ancient account that survived censorship, the story ends the same way, not with a victory cry, but with a silence deeper than judgment. The angel left, and hell stood motionless. The throne of fire cracked, the rivers stilled, and the air shimmered with something hell had never felt before: peace. It wasn't forgiveness, it was recognition. Lucifer didn't fall again, he simply remembered what falling cost. The light that entered his kingdom hadn't destroyed him, it had reminded him. For a fleeting instant, the one who once stood closest to the throne of God saw himself as he had been, radiant, obedient, beloved. That memory burned more than any punishment. Pride can survive hatred, but it cannot survive nostalgia for heaven. The angels who followed him, those who had forgotten their own origin, felt the same fracture. The fire inside them dimmed, not from defeat, but from comprehension. The rebellion had never been independence. It had always been estrangement. And in the wake of that revelation, hell itself began to kneel. Not out of faith, out of truth. The ancient Syriac hymn Canticum Ignium describes this moment as the bowing of the flame. It says, "The fire saw the light and bent its crown," a poetic way of saying that even what burns cannot deny what ignited it. When the angel departed, the mark he left behind was not a scar, it was a seed. From that moment forward, hell could never again claim to be separate from heaven. Every rebellion carries its own contradiction. Lucifer's greatest lie was that darkness could exist apart from light. But when that light stood before him, silent and sovereign, the lie collapsed under its own weight. The kingdom he built on defiance bowed, not because it was conquered, but because it was reminded of its origin. The fire bowed. But did that submission end there? Or was it the beginning of something far more dangerous? A remembrance spreading through the shadows, one whisper at a time. The descent ended, but its echo never did. Every record, from Gnostic hymns to early monastic writings, insists that the silence left behind in hell never fully faded. The light that remained became something far more subversive than punishment. It became a memory that trembles. Even now, in the unseen architecture of existence, hell remembers the authority that once stood in its midst, and that memory is still active. It appears in the sudden weight that falls upon deceit, in the guilt that haunts corruption, in the tremor that touches any soul that defies truth too long. Authority like that doesn't vanish, it reverberates. The angel's descent wasn't an isolated miracle, it was a law being reasserted. Every lie eventually meets its origin, and when it does, it bows. That's why pride fears silence, because silence is where truth waits. Lucifer still reigns over fire, but even he cannot escape what remains written beneath his throne. Remancit lux. The light remained. Authority doesn't conquer, it reveals. It doesn't punish, it reminds. And once truth is revealed, rebellion has no foundation left to stand on. That's why hell still trembles, not because it's weak, but because it remembers, and that memory has a pulse. You can feel it every time light enters a lie, every time courage walks into corruption, every time truth refuses to retreat. That's when the same authority returns, the same silent dominion that once stood before the morning star and made him bow. If you followed this far, remember, light doesn't need to fight darkness. It only needs to appear. And when it does, the shadows have one choice: to remember who they came from. If you believe light still enters darkness, share this story. Subscribe, not for faith alone, but for revelation. Because what began as myth may yet be prophecy. Hell still trembles, and somewhere that light is stirring again.